Much. Thank you so much. We're really honored to be here. I got to be here last year and had just a really positive, joyful experience. I know Isaac is connected with a lot of folks here and at AKA, so we are grateful to be here, and I feel really honored. I see some faces that I've seen on social media and doing really important work in the field. So always have to say, as a non-adoptee, I feel really, really privileged to even be part of this world. Um, I'm gonna brag on Isaac a little bit more. His bio precedes him, but Isaac was someone when I was doing my own research that through his social media presence, I was getting really wanted advice from him, and then he agreed to be part of my study, um, and I just learned so much from him, and I consider him a real leader in the field, and also feel like privileged to call him a friend now. I probably text him and call him for advice on all levels, professionally and as a father of a young black man, and as a white dad of a black man who's navigating young adulthood. Isaac has been a lifesaver in lots of ways. Isaac, you want to say anything before we jump into the slides?
Oh no, just that the feeling is mutual. It's I'm happy to call you a friend, and I remember that Facebook DM all those years ago now. It was before you even started your research, and so I'm glad that we're here now. Like, gosh, it's like probably 4 years later.
Yeah.
And so excited to be here. Excited to see so many familiar faces. Katie, so good to see. It's been so long. Yeah, so I'm just excited to be here and hang out.
Yeah, so we really arranged this to be a little bit of upfront knowledge and sharing, and then some Q&A where I get to interview Isaac, and he gets to share some of his stories and perspective. I get to throw some research in there, and then we open it up more for a Q&A. Um, as you all know, as you probably know coming into this, um, schools can be sites of amazing growth, supporting agency building, supporting strong identity building, or schools can be real sites of trauma. And that's for really any kid, but it's only magnified if you're an adopted or looked after or child in any kind of kinship, foster or kinship care. I use the term looked after broadly. I stole it from the United Kingdom system, and I felt like it was a really holistic, supportive term to think about any child who's ever been in any sort of care. A lot of the outcomes and experiences between looked after, generally speaking, and that can even looked after can even include every weekend I go to live with my grandparents, even if they're biological, and then I'm living with my biological parents during the weekdays or any version of that. The experiences and outcomes are really, really similar. They can be much more extreme if we think about the foster care to prison pipeline would be like the most extreme negative outcomes that occur in school. But the daily sense of belonging on lots of measures for students who live in multiple households, who navigate multiple families, whether in their mind or on a daily basis, can be really, really similar. Um, I know that this was spoken to if you were in the morning session. We're all entering this space navigating so much uncertainty. A population that I work with a lot in my day to day, besides adopted and looked after students, are refugee, migrant, newcomer families. I live in Chicagoland and I support principals. A lot of their experiences are very, very similar. They're living in kinship care. If they've been removed from their family for whatever reason, difficulty um, in transitioning during their journey, trauma experience. So as we navigate sort of a climate of uncertainty and possible real, uncontrollable forces, I just want to recognize that there is so much uncertainty and possible pain that can show up here, whether you're a parent or someone who's reflecting back on your own experiences in school. So obviously, I know this has been said many, many times, but tap out if you need to. If I say something that is triggering or offensive, call me out. I'm a non adoptee. I know I need to do that. My own kids are doing that every single night at the dining room table. dinner table. So I'm more than happy to be called on any missteps that I make. So I'm going to get into it and share my screen. You can see that, right? The two of us again. Okay. So our goals for the day, like I said, we're going to hear about Isaac's story. Um, he's got lots of stories and lots of materials out there, so he'll choose the spots to share, really related to being educated, and that can be formal or informal. Um, and Isaac will share that he's also a child of educators, which I think does shape his experiences. I'll share a little bit about my research, more on the findings, like what we need schools to do to center the experiences of adopted and looked after students. I steal the term centering from a lot of anti-racism work, where if you know the work of like Courageous Conversations, Glenn Singleton, where he talks about decentering whiteness. I stole that because if we're really going to be strong advocates for adopted and looked after students, we shouldn't apologize about centering their experiences. I also come from the perspective of when we can do right by adopted and looked after students, the tide rises and everyone benefits. Also, that's a model that we think of when we think about special education. If we do right by all students with disabilities, we actually do right by all children. And then the overlap between students with disabilities and children in foster care, especially foster care adopted students, is really, really high. We were meeting last night, and a principal shared 40% of children in special ed um, have come in with both identities. Um, and I'm the parent of two kids with special needs also. So we're going to learn more from Isaac's life work. Then we'll enter into a more of an interactive discussion and share a couple of takeaways and resources. I think I've got to get some of the hard copies to AKA so it can be on the website too. I apologize that those might not be up there yet. Goals for today, because I'm always a teacher and we make teachers do this still. So just to put it out there, we want to develop an understanding of how how adoptee educators navigate their dual roles. Isaac's always showing up. Sorry, I'm speaking for you here, Isaac. He's always showing up as both. And that's a burden and a privilege for us. In my work with adoptees, that was talked about a lot. Again, a lot of parallels here with BIPOC educators or LGBTQIA plus educators who are doing the work of trying to educate children about difference and also doing the emotional work while they're actually standing there of navigating worlds that are not friendly to them. Enhancing awareness of key considerations in adoption education. So, kind of what is possible? What is the promise of public education? And it doesn't have to just be public education. Private, if you know the history of private schools, even if they're religious, they were designed to be models for public schools or set up to fill gaps that public schools were not providing. And so we are. I'm always coming from the perspective of we can hold our private schools to really high standards too, and equipping participants with actionable insights for improving adoption practice. So what can you do when you step away? Connection to the theme here. I was excited to see the theme because Isaac was willing to talk. So we got personal narratives, challenging and expanding the narrative, narratives as tool for advocacy, storytelling as power, and creating space for diverse adoption narratives. Isaac, you want to take it?
Sure. Well, this is the quote that I chose. Um, and I'm gonna share a little bit of my story, and I'm gonna share, I don't know, I guess I'm gonna share a little bit more on the education path, but we'll tie into so many other things. But I chose this quote kind of thinking that maybe the audience might be a little bit more parent focused, but it seems like from everybody who I know in here, it's actually largely adoptees. But I still think this is a great quote, which is that I believe one of the most sacrificial acts of love adoptive parents can do is give up their preconceptions and agendas about what their child's view should be and be open to hear the conflicting emotions and thoughts their child often experiences. That's by Sherry Eldridge from her book 25 Things. I think it's called 25 Things Adoptees Wish Their Adoptive Parents Knew. And I find that book to be really fantastic and very helpful, not only in talking with adoptees and putting language behind many of our feelings growing up, but also very helpful to adoptive parents to really understand just how complex the adoptee experience is, also how complex our thoughts and feelings can be. And I love this idea and this idea behind not only adoptive parenting, but also working with adoptees. We have to be really open to hear these conflicting thoughts and emotions that adoptees and looked after children are experiencing and feeling. All right. Well, I'll share a little bit of my story here. And then I guess if you want a little bit more of it, you can get this book here. Um, you know, if you don't know, I'm a transracial adoptee. Maybe start there. So I was transracially adopted when I was 2. Uh, and I think for me, most of my experiences growing up were very isolated. Being one of 2 or 3 Black people in a space, those 2 or 3 other Black people also being adopted. So none of us having necessarily any understanding of our own racial identity. And so that, I mean, I think that's a really big pillar of my story is often feelings of isolation, of loneliness, and often feeling like nobody really saw me growing up. And I think that translated to school as well. When I think about my experiences in schooling, I remember that, I was in a very Christian community, very kind of private Christian school community, and they were very familiar with adoption. Adoption was not an unfamiliar thing. There wasn't an overwhelming amount of adoptees that went to the school, but because churches adopt very frequently, the ideas of adoption were very common. And so adoption was very known, but the ideas of loss and grief or trauma connected to adoption were never really recognized. A story that my mom tells is how in second grade I was having a lot of issues. I was having a lot of issues keeping up with the class. I was behind in reading. And when she went with my second grade teacher to talk about it, try to figure out what was going on, and my mom mentioned, well, he's adopted. He's been really struggling with his adoption at around this time. I had recently found out that my birth mother kept another child that she had, so she placed me for adoption about 3 years prior, but she just had a child and kept her. And so I'm a 6, 7 year old kind of grappling with this concept. And when my mom told my teacher about this, the teacher was confused on how that had any connection. She was like, "Well, that doesn't seem to have any connection to this. He wouldn't have any problems in school because of that." Um, and just my mom having to explain the idea of loss to my second grade teacher and how it may feel for me to one just be adopted, but also to be navigating this now feelings of like abandonment and rejection. But just like a lot of my education, very very marked with that. A lot of spaces that definitely did not show any mercy or grace around the fact that I might be struggling with something different. I remember this kind of going into my high school years where I guess I wasn't the most behaved child. You know what I mean? I wasn't the best kid in town. Um, but oftentimes, whether it was people that we went to church with, people that I was in, I was homeschooled and then I went to online school for some of my later years of school. But in all those settings, even when I would go to like homeschool co-op classes, many people viewed all of my behavior as just being a troubled child, right? This is just a bad kid, was a label that was often put on me. There was no thoughts or feelings that maybe my behavior had something to do with my adoption. There was no recognition of adoption even in that context. Like when I would ever get in trouble, whether with my parents or with people in these co-op settings or online school settings, because you can still go to the principal in online school, sadly. It's very unfortunate. But you can still go. And all those settings really, it was always about the action. It wasn't what was behind the action. There was never any conversations about anything else going on other than why I wasn't turning things in on time or why I was being destructive. When I think adoption had a large part to do, actually, I know personally, just kind of being able to reflect back that adoption had a large part to do with why I had behavioral issues, why I was acting out, why I was trying to earn attention and affection and love through those behaviors, right? While I was trying to earn, um, whether it be laughs or approval from classmates. All those things were very prevalent in a lot of my upbringing. I think to kind of transition the story to college, even, I think it's another education system that adoptees navigate. Going to college was like a whole nother situation because at college I wasn't adopted anymore. I was, but people in the community of college didn't know I was adopted anymore. So now I'm in college as a transracial adoptee, having to be asked about racial issues that I wasn't growing up understanding or aware of. And so now I'm isolated in these two ways. I feel like, oh, I'm not really black because I don't know how to answer these questions that I'm getting. Um, and I'm adopted. So now I have to, because I don't know these things, I'm having to give all these people the context of why I don't know these questions. And so I think that in both of those contexts, adoption and the fact that I was interracially adopted had a big impact on my ability to navigate the space.
Mm. So we're gonna go into a Q&A in a little bit. So you're planting seeds for jumping into those questions. I'm gonna just take this off for a second, and then I'm gonna lay some of the research out. So my research out, and just like I asked you to interrupt, share, correct in the chat, if you have any other relevant research, things that you know. Feel free to share. Um, Feel free to share that as well. Can you see my screen still again? Okay. This is just a little bit about me. This is my family. We're a two-dad family, two white dads. This is from a couple of years ago. My son, I'm really happy. Again, I text and call Isaac with lots of questions. My son here, his name is Mosi, and he's a freshman at Northern Illinois. I'm in Chicago. He's in Northern Illinois, and navigating all of the things that Isaac just talked about. And just a reminder that thank God I'm always a parent. I'm always his, he's always mine, and he's off in the world navigating what it means to be off in the world and not immediately and visibly connected to any parents. We go to, he's in an acting program. He invites us up to see the shows that the theater puts on. We go and we show up, and his friends have no idea who we possibly could be. And we talk about that, and we don't talk about that, and um, it's part of the journey, and it's every emotion all at the same time. My daughter is she was younger here. She's 13 now, so navigating very, very, very young womanhood as a black daughter of two white men, cisgendered men. Both of them have recently visited the places where they were born and connected to biological families. So that's sort of how I show up, being more like witness to this and experiencing it too, as a family member and someone with like just parenting is my life, as I'm sure a lot of you can relate. All of you can relate to it with your parents. This is just my research, and I put it up on Amazon self-published. I'm not pushing it here because it's pretty boring and there are lots of errors in it. Um, but it was a passion project for me, so felt good to get it out there. It was a case study on educator practice. I worked with 10 educators who were all adoptees themselves and have taught, and every educator has adopted or looked after students. So they're coming at it with sort of that split vision of here I am showing up in my school. As an adoptee myself, a lot of my coworkers don't fully understand what my experience has been, and they're not very curious about it. And I'm here as an advocate for students who have similar backgrounds in this um, very in this world that's really not very friendly or not very curious even about the adoptee or looked after experience. Always need to shout this out. I know in the room it probably goes without saying, but the intersectionality that adoptees and children in care walk around with, in school systems, everything. Well, in our country, everything is politicized. In our world, everything is politicized. So when you're walking around with multiple identities that are being politicized around you and you're a child and you haven't been able to make sense of that. And then on top of that, you're trying to navigate multiple families and extreme loss or the trauma of adoption or being relinquished or being, or even, shifting between multiple homes causes lots and lots of disequilibrium and often isolation. And as we all know, when all those chemicals are swirling, it's pretty impossible to access a traditional educational program. This all framed what I learned from all of the teachers that I was working with. I'm going to go over it quickly, and if you want to talk more, you can. We can talk more. I love these things. So there are four findings that came out of my research from working with these educators. The first one being school climate that is affirming. We can think about, there's a lot of talk now, if you work in schools or you're familiar with schools, about social emotional learning. Social and emotional learning, or trauma-informed teaching, which is often like separate from academics. Like, we're going to be trauma-informed, we're going to use trauma-informed language. Those are just like small parts of an entire school climate that is affirming. These are some of the characteristics: school environments where storytelling is affirmed, understanding that behavior is communication, kind of like what Isaac was saying. If we see kids who are so-called acting out, we really want to understand that that's their version of communication and be curious about that. The schools that were really felt safe, and I know safe is a loaded word, but felt like there was some security for adopted or looked after children, and teachers named it, was a place where loss could be talked about. I've been in schools a lot this week, um, and everyone's in shock and not sure what to do. But it's also, I take it as also an indicator that we don't really know how to talk about loss. We don't know what's to come, and that makes sense. But we also don't know how to talk about what we just lost or could have lost with world events. Really specific things came up, like affinity groups. So being proud, uh, having spaces where children were allowed to be proud of being adopted or live, share their lives with multiple families. Um, Not only was important for adopted and looked after kids, but also sent a signal to non-adoptees or non-ALA kids, adopted, looked after kids, that this was a really important part of our community, that this group mattered enough that we give them space to be together and share. And then schools where adults and kids were curious about ALA adults too. Again, all of the similarities with Black educators, BIPOC educators, or queer educators, LGBTQ plus IA educators. If a building's not curious and affirming about the adults, that's a good proxy. They're not going to know what to do with the kids. And I will say, my word belonging is a huge word right now, all over schools everywhere, right? Like, everyone belongs and we're going to make everyone belong. Think of the classic Brene Brown thing that's floating around everywhere. The opposite of belonging is fitting in. Um, when we talk, a lot of schools will use that. Like, we're all going to get everyone school shirts. Everyone's going to look like they fit into the school community. That's sort of like everyone has a belly button, right? That doesn't get to really understanding the complexity of people's lives. The second finding was that academics have to be inclusive of adopted and looked after people's lives and stories. So social emotional learning is part of the school day. It matters. A lot of schools will do morning meetings, community circle, and it will be isolated from the academics of the day. That's not good enough. Um, we need to make sure that the social emotional work, if we say everyone matters, everyone's voice matters, that has to show up 15 minutes later when we're having a read aloud or a class discussion or anything. And then the materials that you use, or the stories that are told, whether it's about adoption history or major figures who have been adopted themselves, or stories that are going on in the world. Think of the World Series. We can pull Aaron Judge. Think of someone in the media who's retiring to care for her kids. What's her name? Hoda. Um, it's so easy to pull any headline and to find something that has to do with adoption. Um, there are celebrities that kids love. It's all over TikTok. Like the material, the content is there. And then you can go towards like, this is an amazing graphic novel about a child who is deaf, and her story. And by the way, she's adopted too. And the story about her being deaf gets lots of attention, thankfully. We don't have enough of that. And the part of her adoption gets really buried for some reason. So, how do we elevate that? Three kids who are this is a picture book, three kids who are being raised by in kinship care. A lot of you have heard about this. Culturally responsive teaching does matter. That's just good teaching. We don't hide stories. We're honest about history. And there's a lot, we have plenty of adoption stories in our own history about things the government has, you all know, the government has done, what the government is about to do, what the government um, um, feels like it can do, that can be talked about. And then the classic piece of mirrors, windows, and sliding doors. So when we have adopted and looked after kids in the classroom, we always have to be sure that they have access to their own stories. That's the idea of mirrors. And if they don't, they're not able to access other curriculum because they feel like they always have to mask or do extra sort of cognitive rigor that takes them away from um, learning new material, connecting to new material. These are structures that happen in a classroom. Oops, sorry. Structures in a classroom that really, really matter because it gives children different ways of working. So allowing for inquiry, letting kids ask questions and be curious about material. If we're doing biographies and child, adopted or not, says, I really want to research someone in history who was adopted, like, does the teacher have resources for that? Integrated or interdisciplinary units. A lot of this has to do with kids being able to hold on to content and connect things. So if I'm a child and I'm studying something, let's just take math in isolation, just raw numbers, and I've already been shut down from learning. Can we get some story problems in there that talk about, um, you know, things that might mirror my experience, whether it's travel, living in a different geographic area, different types of families, names that might be different than in the context that they're sitting in. So making sure that even story problems in math, something like that can mirror. A big finding, I kind of went into my research expecting there to be a lot about peer relationships, and it was really played down a lot. A lot of what I learned from the educators was, and this matches attachment theory, if adopted and looked after kids weren't attaching strongly to the adults, if they didn't feel a strong connection to the teacher, then the peer, no matter how much their peers connect with them, loved them, understood them, then school still didn't feel safe. It's a reminder of how much authority and power teachers hold. So peers matter, right? Peers help keep us safe. We can pull them aside and be really honest with them, but it sort of becomes unsafe or like a joke when there's that teacher who still doesn't understand you and you only have your buddy to be honest with. It's not making the most of the school experience. This is always my go-to video for relationships, for building relationships. So I'm going to just show a minute of it, minute and a half, I think. Can you hear that? No.
I can't.
Stop sharing.
Relationships. James Comer says that no significant learning can occur without a significant relationship. George Washington Carver says all learning is understanding relationships. Everyone in this room has been affected by a teacher or an adult. For years, I have watched people teach. I have looked at the best and I've looked at some of the worst. A colleague said to me one time, they don't pay me to like the kids. They pay me to teach a lesson. The kids should learn it. I should teach it. They should learn it. Case closed. Well, I said to her, you know, kids don't learn from people they don't like. She said, that's just a bunch of hooey. And I said to her, well, your year is going to be long and arduous, dear. Needless to say, it was. Some people think that you can either have it in you to build a relationship or you don't. I think Stephen Covey had the right idea. He said you ought to just throw in a few simple things, like seeking first to understand as opposed to being understood. Simple things like apologizing. You ever thought about that? Tell a kid you're sorry, they're in shock. I taught a lesson once on ratios. I'm not real good with math, but I was working on it. And I got back and looked at that teacher edition. I taught the whole lesson wrong. So I came back to class the next day and I said, look, guys, I need to apologize. I taught the whole lesson wrong. I'm so sorry. They said, that's okay, Miss Pearson. You were so excited. We just let you go. I have had classes that were so low, so academically deficient that I cried. I wondered, how am I going to take this group in 9 months from where they are to where they need to be? And it was difficult. It was awfully hard. How do I raise the self-esteem of a child and his academic achievement at the same time? One year I came up with a bright idea. I told all my students, you were chosen to be in my class because I am the best teacher and you are the best students. They put us all together so we could show everybody else how to do it. One of the students said, really? I said, really? We have to show the other classes how to do it. So when we walk down the hall, people will notice us. So you can't make noise. You just have to strut. And I gave him a saying to say, I am somebody. I was somebody when I came. I'll be a better somebody when I leave. I am powerful and I am strong. I deserve the education that I get here. I have things to do, people to impress, and places to go. And they said, yeah. Yes.
I show that all the time, and you can never show it too much. It's like the teacher everyone wants, but you can imagine if you feel like no one understands you, no one gets your story, and no one wants to know, and then you find a teacher like that, which every teacher could be, who's very, very curious and also believes in you in that way. That's how relationships can and should work. And something that came out of my research is it's those teachers who inspire the whole group and really make you feel like you belong. It's not just we're all wearing this t-shirt. It's we're gonna be so successful here. And those teachers who pull the kid aside and really, really get to know them one-on-one also. One more, my fourth area has to do with really understanding how students gain agency. So school is about school, and being successful is about being successful in school, and then what? I mentioned my own child who's out in the world, and 60% of his time as a freshman in college is navigating the world. His meal plan, his money, his laundry, his friends, going to parties, getting around campus, and that's life. And I worked with teachers in schools in my research that started talking about things like, we make sure all of our kids can garden. One of the schools that I worked with is in Brooklyn. Not a lot of access to green space, and they really have to be creative about physical education experiences outside of PE and recess. The principal made sure every single child could ride a bike. The principal made sure the kids knew how, as part of their school, knew how to ride the subway to get to a public pool where they all took swimming lessons. 100% of second graders took swim lessons. 100% of third graders learned how to ride a bike. The principal's an adoptee herself. I asked her, I'm like, well, this is amazing. I would love my kid to go to the school. And what does it have to do with adoption? And she just said everything. I had her tell me more about that. And she was like, she's like, this is all about independence and agency. We come into the world, I'm speaking for her here, we come into the world and we understand that when we're removed from our family, we go to a new family, we have to navigate things on our own. We're always going to be faced with people and situations where other people are trying to control us and we don't totally feel understood. And so she talked about in childhood, and yes, it had to do with her urban setting, being able to ride a bike, ride the subway, swim, because you're always near the water in New York City, had to do with having a strong sense of agency and independence. And she wanted every child to feel it, no matter what job they had, whether they went to college or not. She wanted to run into the, if she ran into the kids when she was 18, when they were 18, 30, however old, she wanted to know that they were independent and felt a sense of agency. So that's how she poured into kids. So that's my research to frame things. I'm gonna let you all make the connections when Isaac is talking with all of those things, because his contributions were a big part of my research. Isaac, before we do some Q&A, anything you wanna segue with?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think that what you touched on there really helps. I think it helps build a lot of lines for people to understand how to apply this to maybe their school systems if you're working in a school, or how to maybe advocate for your adoptee. I think breaking it down on those 4 layers is really helpful for people. I think it connects to anybody who's an adoptee that's been in a school setting here can all see ourselves in that. We can all see what was missing from our experience.
Awesome. So Isaac and I also did a little event last night, and I'm going to start the same way, Isaac.
Do it.
Talk about the positive. Like what were things that kind of like some of the instances we had there? What were some of the things that
Yeah.
people did do to make you feel seen and understood?
Yeah, and I think I started this off the same way last time, which is like there was limited in terms of school setting things that I really felt like were super positive. Not to say that I didn't have a great education, but in terms of the setting, just kind of thinking about the environment, small private classical Christian schools were where I grew up in. It's where my dad worked for a majority of my life, and so the positive I think was just that there were other adoptees. I think that was the main positive. I remember one of my other friends that was adopted, as being 10, 11, and talking about him meeting, his birth parents. I remember those conversations that we had. And those connections only happened because we were being educated the same way. And, I remember even, he lost his birth mother about a week before he was going to meet her. And I remember just spending time as 10, 11-year-olds talking about that. And so definitely, if I can think of a positive part of my experience, was that because it was such an adoption community, I did get to spend time being around other adoptees growing up.
Awesome. You mentioned, and this is what you do for your work, is storytelling. And one of the pieces that I failed to mention when we talk about climate is that storytelling piece. And I don't just mean a kid has the opportunity in class to tell their story, but as they're walking through the hall and a teacher says, "How was your weekend?" If a kid wanted to say, "I was with my birth parents," or "I visited my mom in prison," or whatever situation they dealt with, that story is picked up and affirmed by the adult. Can you share instances where that happened with you, or maybe it's just the power of your storytelling, like what it does for you?
Yeah. I mean, growing up, not as much. I think growing up, talking about adoption, for me, adoption has always been very hard. Just the understanding that to be adopted, somebody else had to place me for adoption. That has always been a really hard concept for me. My parents were much more understanding about that than anybody else. And so my parents always understood that that would be painful for me, though nobody else I grew up around understood that. It wasn't until I got a little bit older and did do a lot more of that storytelling that I think people started to connect those lines. And I found that for me and for most people that I grew up around and in the community I was raised in, adoption was never framed outside of a positive light. So it was very hard for them to understand that there could even be a negative side. I mean, we touched on this last night a little bit, but even the concept of a birth parent for some people is like, oh, I never even thought about them. You know what I mean? For some people, when they hear about adoption, they've completely forgotten that element. They've only thought about the family being built. And a lot of times, depending on how you were educated about it, how adoption was in the community that you were raised in. If you know any adoptees, that can mean that you only think about adoption as being this really positive thing that probably built a family, helped a family that was struggling with infertility. Like you only think about it through these really highs. So to have a child who is struggling and to correlate it to adoption almost seems unimaginable. Like what do you mean? You talking about the child that fixed Jim and Nancy's infertility? Like that can't be the same child, right? That's struggling with adoption. That's the mindset many people have because they haven't even considered that there is a birth parent, that the birth parent has their own feelings, that a child might have feelings about their own birth parent. And so I found through my story and expressing not only the loss of that, so the separation of my birth mother and me, but also the loss of cultural identity, that it started to paint a picture for people that there are these elements of loss and adoption. Doesn't mean that there can't be positives in adoption. But one of the biggest issues I think in adoption is that without acknowledging the loss in adoption, without acknowledging the bad and the hard parts of adoption, you actually can't really appreciate the good parts of it, right? So there is no good parts of adoption unless we have not acknowledged the hard and bad parts of it. There can't be a beautiful family built by adoption if the loss of the adoptee is going to go completely ignored their whole life, because then that child is just he's a pawn in the equation. It's going to suffer. And so I think through my story and my work, I've been able to paint that picture for people very well, for them to at least on a base level see that adoption is more complex than it may have been pictured to them. And it's much more complex than just a fertility journey or an issue conceiving. It's the person's life, it's their experience. And so when we think about how adoption enters any kind of home, we can look at it through the lens of like, yes, this may help me build my family, but it does still involve a loss of a family. And if we don't start on that page, I think we've really lost really the whole thing in adoption. We've lost what adoption is.
It's funny, and I don't want to scare any parent here, but I started to, when I was a principal, I started to learn how other educators perceived adoptees, and I was already an adoptive parent at the time, but I'd gone through the training, and I think the training kind of made me more naive, like, oh, this is our new understanding of adoption. We center the child's experience. I came through adoptive parent training under an openness umbrella. But when I was a principal, I would walk into the teacher's lounge and they'd be talking about children who are having problems, and they'd say, they're adopted. Or we'd be at a special ed meeting and they'd say, well, the kid is adopted. And it was very like black and white thinking, like, this is another part of it. I was like, oh, poor child, or poor parents, but with no depth or nuance to any of that. So really pathologizing all around. Without any curiosity. And so it was sort of like an aha to me, both like, oh my goodness, this is how my own kids are being perceived. And how are we going to build nuance into this to say, children are children are children and bring so many assets to school. Let's start that there. Being adopted can be one aspect of identity. Loss and trauma is profound and shapes that identity or experience in school. And we've got to fully humanize and be really curious about the kid's experience. That feels like such a huge leap.
Yeah. And I think you can also, if you think about it, just kind of when we think about trying to make school systems safe places for children, if that's how they're being perceived at school, that's how they're being perceived in most situations that they enter, right? So, which means that school just becomes a part of just another place where they can't be themselves, just another place that doesn't understand their experience. And so when we think about belonging and the work that you're trying to do and how schools can be this safe space for children, I think this is a vital part of it because they're already going to go out into the world that is not going to get this. They're going to be in several spaces, whether it's college, work. I mean, gosh, I can't tell you how many work instances I've had throughout my life where adoption got brought. I mean, I've been speaking on adoption through various jobs for the last 7 years. And anytime people ask me what I do outside of work, why I need time off, and I mention adoption, I have to go through this whole thing, right? And I run into all kinds of perceptions. And that's an experience that every adoptee is having whenever adoption is brought up. So to have it also happen in a setting that's supposed to be safe for learning, to feel understood, I think it puts a magnet on it.
Because I'm that much older than you, because I ask you so much about my own son, I do want to ask you something, Isaac, and it's about your self-care. So being a Black male in America who's always putting your story out there, and I know you've got healthy boundaries, and how do you make sure that um, you're giving enough in nuanced ways, and that you still maintain your own agency as you're educating others?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. Self-care is a tough question. I think that self-care when it comes to sharing my adoption story is pretty dialed. Like I think I actually share a lot less than people realize. And so I think people think I share a lot. And so people look at me like, I can't believe you share so much. But a lot of what I share has been like, I've been sharing the same thing for like years and years and years. And so when I share new stuff, I actually find it more interesting. And so, people will ask me, how do I share so much about my experience growing up as transracial adoptee? I was like, I don't even think I could probably give you one of my presentations right now without any slides, just off the top of my head. That to me is not as significant, but I've started now, especially in some of the more broader work I do in adoption, talking a lot more about loss and talking a lot more about grief and talking a lot more about overall identity for adoptees, which is actually a heavier lift for me. That's work that I had not had as much dialed in. And so I spend a lot of time now thinking about how I want to bring those more vulnerable pieces of my story to this space, what it means for me to do that. Because to me, that it's a more overwhelming part of the mission. I think there's a lot of transracial identity issues and complications. But I think one thing that all adoptees share is a really deep feeling of loss and grief. And the work that we do at Identity, I think is really, really vital that we have a really strong stance and perception on that, which means me going into a place inside of myself where I have to think about that for myself. I have to think about all the ways that it was ignored, all the ways that I didn't get to process my own grief and loss. And that's a more complicated actually part of it for me than talking about the racial element. And so I think there's a lot of things that I do to make sure that I'm not overextending when it comes to sharing my story. But I think that there's at each stage of it unlocks new information. I give a different part of myself, I think, to this work at each stage. And so like I think I gave pretty much everything I could when it came to the transracial adoption piece. You know what I mean? Whether you see the docu-series or the podcast or whatever you've seen, like I've given a lot of myself when it comes to the issues of race and identity. And I find myself now wanting to give parts of myself now that are more about attachment, loss, grief, all those things, because those are the things that have defined my adult experience. Race has not defined my adult experience as much because I chose to change community and find place and find safety. But loss, grief, attachment, they have defined my adult relationships. They have been such a heavy part of my inability to connect to people, that my inability to build deeper relationships and friendships or romantically, and so much work that's had to be done now into my late 20s, trying to navigate this and trying to build healthy boundaries and self-love, and all these things. I didn't realize that from the time I was adopted at 2, I've been hating myself more and more each year. And so these are the things that I find now that I'm giving in a different way that require more balance. But to me are the real important things. They're the undertones of all different kinds of adoption, international, domestic, same race. They're the undertones of our shared experience. And they're the things that I think follow us for life.
Yeah, I mean, you're an incredible role model. Like, our society's not good at talking about the things you're talking about, and so to come at it from having experienced such profound loss so early and be so self-aware. Like, I think I don't want to water it down by saying this, but I think it resonates with folks who have experienced lots of different type of loss too, who haven't been able to talk about it. So
I hope so. I
um,
hope so.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, Stepping back a little bit, I think, two more questions and then we'll open up for Q&A. I think this taps into it too. Like, talk about your ways of handling misconceptions that are thrown at you, that for some people could be offensive or burdensome to them. But what do you, as an educator, how do you handle misconceptions that are thrown at you, whether it is about transracial adoption, whether it's about adoption? I know you personalize your story, but how do you
Yeah.
stay holding hands with people, but also make sure they're on a path towards curiosity and openness?
Yeah. I think this is probably, I feel like for what I do, this is like all I'm doing. You know what I mean? Especially, when you think about a lot of my work is in the adoptive parent world. And so I spend a lot of time with people who are just entering, thinking about adoption, just entering the perspective place, maybe just being placed. And so they're actually just kind of the hitting the real part of this journey. And to them and to many people, I think there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of wanting to believe that this is going to be something that it isn't going to be. Wanting to believe that your child is going to be somebody that you can't expect them to be, right? And so I think navigating this is something that I think first off, I don't suggest to many people. There's a lot of adoptees that come to me and say like, "Hey, I want to work in a die. I want to do this." I'm like, first off, you probably don't. I'm happy to like if you really want to. I'm happy to I'm happy to support you however you want to do it. But I want you to know that this is like its own unique version of hell, because you're going to say the same things over and over, and there's going to be a lot of people that believe that you should not feel the way that you feel. There's going to be a lot of pushback. There's going to be a lot of dismissing of your experiencing in your story, whether directly to you or around you. Um, and so that's the first one, I think, is like understand that there's a ton of preconceived notions here. And if you're an adoptee, this is an especially hard space to navigate if you're trying to educate people. I think how I personally handled them is I've just decided that that's my hell. How I've personally decided is just like I just sit in it and I just do the same. I do the same thing over and over. And I think when you're starting out, so like starting out, it was much more like rocky and trying to figure it out, trying different methods. Now I pretty much do the same thing, which is ask questions, just help people understand. I just ask a lot of questions about why people feel the way they do, why they may think the way they do about adoption. I share pieces of my story in subtle ways. Sometimes I don't directly try to counteract somebody. I just will mention my birth parent in like a unique way. Maybe I'll just mention, oh, I just remember thinking a lot about my birth parents as a kid. And sometimes that's enough to like start a new conversation around it because again, birth parents are often forgotten. I may, mention, just not growing up around anybody that looks like me, those things. And I found that with people who are especially maybe more willfully and like not wanting to learn, like no, they're not in the room to learn, they're in the room to kind of keep within their own agenda. Sharing small things that open up more questions from people is a huge game changer. I mean, my whole presentation is shaped around setting up questions. I do a transracial adoption training, a very standard one I've updated it, but I've done it for probably 3 years straight. And the whole thing, it explains a lot, it tells my story, but the whole thing just sets up different idea points for people. From my own story, it's like kind of helps people understand, oh, this is interesting. I never thought that my transracial child may experience this or may need to know this. And then I talk about bias and I set up bias and how you may not even have thought about bias or how it might affect your child. But remember how you perceive people that don't look like you sometimes? Remember how you like move differently sometimes? That's exactly how people are going to treat your child. Right. And so I try to do a lot of setups for people to where they're almost kind of thinking their way into the understanding because it's really actually not that hard, right? We all know this in the room who are adoptees or work in adoption that actually understanding the concept of loss and adoption is actually not hard at all. There's very clear lines to it, but whether it's media, whether it's agencies, it's been purposely kind of set up in a way to where the general public does not think about that specific part of it. So generally, by putting things on the table, people actually think their way into a logical understanding of adoption and it including loss. And so it's kind of a game, maybe, but I think you navigate through it more creatively as the days go by.
Sounds like a superpower either you were born with or you developed from having to
Yeah.
do a lot of people studying to.
Yeah, a lot of development. A lot of
Yeah.
development. I mean, yeah, you have to, and it's you could say the same thing for anything, right? We think about when we're trying to talk with people about racism who believe racism isn't real, right? Same thing with LGBTQ plus rights. And I mean, the people who choose to believe something and just not even try to research it, when you're trying to navigate that conversation, you have to do so many levels of humanizing, so many levels of like understanding that kind of get them onto the playing field where you can't even have the conversation. And adoptees, I mean, I chose not to go through it very often at work, but I remember that there was a lot of instances at work where I was like, I'm not going to do this here, but like, jokes about, being adopted, being left in the trash can. You know what I mean? Jokes, about, you know, being white, not being black enough, right? And so we live in this world where we almost have to choose also when to educate and when not to educate. I'm sure many adoptees in the room have been in rooms with bosses, coworkers, or maybe just people out, and somebody makes some offhanded comment about you being adopted or adoption in general, and you have to choose in that moment whether this is gonna be your night or you're just gonna tone it out and move on.
Yeah. I'm going to open up for Q&A, get some questions, and I think we can do Q&A and or sharing, if folks have things they wanted to add to the conversation or clarify. You know, mic off and jump in, or feel free to throw out questions. I'm going to look in the chat.